Hernan Cortes drowned in the black water of Lake Texcoco on the night of June 30, 1520, and the Spanish conquest of Mexico died with him. The commander who had held a fractious expedition together through mutiny, siege, and open revolt went under the causeway waters, weighted by the very gold his men had looted from the Mexica treasury, and he did not surface. In the darkness and the rain, on the broken span of the Tlaxcalan causeway, the retreat that later generations would have called La Noche Triste became something worse than a defeat. It became a leaderless slaughter. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. To understand the weight of that single death, you have to understand how much had already gone wrong. Cortes had landed on the Mexican coast in 1519 and founded Villarica de la Vera Cruz to slip the authority of the Cuban governor, Diego Velázquez. He had entered Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, been received by the Tlatoani Moctezuma II, and then seized his host as a hostage in his own palace. He had marched to the coast in May 1520 to defeat Panfilo de Narvaez at Chempoala and absorb his men. And he had returned to find that Pedro de Alvarado, left in command, had ordered the massacre of unarmed nobles during the festival of Tlaxcala and set the whole city aflame with fury. Every thread of the enterprise ran through one man. On that causeway, the thread was cut. What no one on either side understood that night, what would take years to become visible, was that an empire everyone assumed was doomed had just been handed a future. Cuitlahuac woke on the morning of July 1 to govern a city that had destroyed its besiegers rather than been besieged. Raised as Tlatoani after the death of Moctezuma on or about June 29th, he had directed the counterattack that trapped the Spanish column on the causeways, and now the lake belonged to the Mexica again. The removable wooden bridges, the war canoes that swarmed the retreating soldiers, the causeways themselves, all of it had worked exactly as the island city's defenses were designed to work. In the real history, Cortes survived this same night, regrouped, and won the Battle of Otumba a week later. Here there was no Cortes to rally the survivors, and there was no Otumba. The handful of Spaniards who reached the mainland fled toward the coast as fugitives, not as an army in retreat. The difference mattered more than numbers. A capital that has broken an invasion keeps its granaries, its tribute networks, its priesthood, and its confidence intact. The Mexica did not have to rebuild from ashes. They had to bury their dead, repair the bridges, and take stock of a strange and valuable haul: steel swords, crossbows, a few horses, firearms, and prisoners who spoke of a world across the Eastern Sea. Then came the enemy no warrior could capture. Smallpox had reached Mexico in 1520, carried by a member of the Narvaez expedition, and it was already spreading from the coast toward the highlands. This is the constraint that no favorable divergence can erase. The disease did not care who had drowned on the causeway. It moved through the valley towns in waves, and Tenochtitlan, for all its victory, was not spared the fever and the dying. But it met a different city than the one history recorded. In our timeline, smallpox tore through a Tenochtitlan under siege, starving, its water cut, its command shattered. Cuitlahuac himself died of it within months. Here, the epidemic burned through a capital that was intact, provisioned, and organized, its leadership able to isolate the sick, manage the dead, and hold the machinery of the state together through the worst of it. The demographic wound was still catastrophic. Whole districts emptied. But an ordered society survives a plague that shatters a besieged one, and the Triple Alliance endured its passage rather than dissolving beneath it. The empire came out of the sickness diminished and grieving, and still standing. Far to the east, in the Highland Republic that had made the whole conquest possible, the Tlaxcalan lords faced a ruined gamble. Tlaxcala had been at war with the Triple Alliance for generations, and it was Tlaxcalan soldiers who had supplied the bulk of Cortes's fighting men and sheltered him when he was weak. Now the Spanish partner was dead in a lake or scattered on the coast roads, and the ancient enemy had just proven it could annihilate a European army. The council had to choose between renewed war against a victorious empire and some wary accommodation with it. They chose survival, as small states hemmed by large ones usually must. The consequences of this decision would shape the next century, but first, we need to understand what the Mexica did with the years the causeway had bought them. Diego Velázquez had always claimed the enterprise as his own, and with Cortes gone, he moved to reassert control. New expeditions probed the coast, some backed by Velázquez, others by a Spanish crown hungry for the wealth the earlier reports had promised. But they arrived at a mainland that had changed. This was no longer a coast of curious, divided city-states meeting armored strangers for the first time. It was the approach to a power that had already beaten one European army and studied how it fought. The newcomers found watchful garrisons, fortified landings, and Mexica emissaries who knew exactly what a horse was, what a cannon could and could not do, and how long it took a crossbow to reload. For the Mexica, ruled through knowledge as much as through arms. Theirs was an empire of tribute, extending its reach by understanding rival cities and turning their weaknesses against them, and they now turned that same patient attention on the foreigners. The captured horses were bred rather than eaten. Steel blades were copied by smiths who already worked obsidian and copper with extraordinary skill. Gunpowder weapons were studied, their supply of powder and shot understood as the true limit on their use. Warriors who had been trained to take enemies alive found that a dismounted, exhausted Spaniard was a prisoner like any other. The empire did not become European. It absorbed what was useful and fitted it into a way of war that was already among the most disciplined in the world. And so European contact with central Mexico bent toward a different shape. Conquest had been tried and had drowned in a lake. What replaced it was negotiation, coastal enclaves granted rather than seized, trade in cacao and cotton and gold conducted between recognized states, diplomacy carried out through intermediaries whose skill now served a very different balance of power. Doña Marina, the interpreter Malintzin, had been indispensable to a commander who no longer existed. The role she had played would be filled by others, but always now in service of an equilibrium rather than an invasion. Ships still came, missionaries and merchants still landed, but they dealt with an empire, not a ruin, and an empire sets its own terms. The map that emerged from this single night was not a triumph and not a utopia. It was simply a different arrangement of the same hard forces. A surviving Aztec state anchored the center of the continent, and around it the pattern of European expansion turned slower, more coastal, and endlessly contested. Indigenous polities persisted as diplomatic and military actors, negotiating, allying, resisting, and sometimes losing, but as agents in their own history rather than its casualties. Smallpox and the diseases that followed still cut deep because no divergence can wish them away. The Spanish still came, and the Portuguese, and later others, because the wealth and the ambition that drove them were real. What changed was that they arrived at a door that could be closed. In our own history, Cortes climbed out of that water, and the empire he faced fell to a siege that ended on August 13, 1521. Everything after followed from his survival. Here the water closed over him, and a different world took shape in the space his absence left, reminding us how much of what we call inevitable rests on the depth of a single flooded causeway, and the weight of the gold a drowning man refused to let go.